And that happened in New Jersey in the late 60s and early 1970s, where a new generation decided that they were no longer going to hide in plain sight, so to speak, but were going to advocate for their rights.
And it is my pleasure to welcome you to sharing the continuing story of Indigenous people in New Jersey. Today, with gratitude, we acknowledge that we are on the traditional homelands of the Lenape people, called Lenape-Hoking. The Lenape are the original people of this land, and we acknowledge their continuing relationship with their territory. A legacy of colonialism, violence, displacement, migration, and settlement has shaped the region we now call New Jersey, impacting generations up to the present day. Still, nations, communities, families, and individuals persist in sustaining oral and cultural traditions and maintain a strong connection to this land. This statement represents a commitment to beginning the ongoing process of relationship building with tribal nations both in and outside of the state's colonized borders, and learning how we can, through respect and connection, support a truthful and inclusive understanding of Indigenous history and contemporary life. Let me also add our thanks to the New Jersey Council for the Humanities for their support of this program today. And now it is my honor to introduce New Jersey's 34th Secretary of State, Tahisha Way.
Greetings, it's New Jersey Secretary of State Tahisha Way, and I'm proud to join you in recognizing the Year of the American Indian in New Jersey as proclaimed by Governor Murphy. The New Jersey Historical Commission and the New Jersey Commission on American Indian Affairs, both located within the Department of State, have been partnering for several years to plan programming focused on Indigenous history and culture in 2021. The commissions have also organized a series of committees to lead planning, including representatives from New Jersey's state-recognized tribal nations and federally recognized tribal nations for whom the region is an ancestral homeland, as well as scholars and humanities professionals in this state. Many thanks to today's participants, and everyone enjoy the program.
That was a formal Dakota greeting. I said, hello, my relatives. I gladly shake all of your hands. As a guest in Lenape-Hoking, I say thank you all for joining us today. Our first presenter, Reverend Dr. John R. Norwood, is a citizen of the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape tribal nation, which he served as a principal justice of the tribal Supreme Court, as a councilman, and as the senior minister to the Nanticoke Lenape Tribal Christian Prayer Circle Ministry. He is the co-chair of the Task Force on Federal Acknowledgement of the National Congress of American Indians and the General Secretary of the Alliance of Colonial Era Tribes. He has represented his tribe at the national and international level and has written about and lectured on tribal history, culture, religion, and current concerns. Since 1992, Dr. Norwood has served as a senior pastor of the Ujima Village Christian Church of Ewing, New Jersey, and is also the founder and director of the Christian Missions School of Theology.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sweet, and thank you to the Historical Commission for hosting this event. That is not my presentation. There we go, okay. I want to greet you all in the Lenape language, Itakwangamamuhemo, Kelik Petakomak Deluensi, and Hake Nanticoke Oklenape. My name is Dr. John Norwood. My tribal family name is Smiling Thunder Bear, and I am Nanticoke and Lenape. My presentation is going to be talking about the southernmost tribe here in New Jersey. We are the Bay Indians. Our tribe occupies the area of the bay called Pawtucket. If we can go to the next slide. And we are interrelated with several other tribes that are actually across the bay in in Delaware. And those tribes include the Lenape Indian tribe of Delaware and the Nanticoke Indian tribe of Delaware. Our families are interrelated. The surnames tend to repeat. In fact, my own surname comes from the Nanticoke Indian tribe. These tribes have been in their respective areas from time immemorial, and we have continued after the breakup of our communities and many migrating out of the region. The area around the bay, as I mentioned, is called Pawtucket. Was the traditional name of the Delaware Bay is Pawtucket, and the traditional name of New Jersey is Shaikby, meaning the area that's by the water's edges. New Jersey is surrounded on three sides by water. In colonial history, our people were referred to as the Bay Indians. Next slide. By the end of the 17th century, even though we were among those that were involved in first contact, in fact, our Nanticoke ancestors were involved in first contact, even including John Smith. When he first arrived in the Delaware Bay, our first effort was to actually try to kill him, because several of the previous engagements that we had with Europeans coming up the Chesapeake and into the various rivers that ran off it, they actually took some of our people. So we were initially hostile, but after some time we began trading with him and the Plymouth colony. In the 17th century, by the end of the 17th century, our people were pressured onto reservations in Delaware, and in the 18th century, even there was one in New Jersey. And we were also forced on to areas that were not official reservations in New Jersey, but were referred to as Indian towns or Indian fields. These reservations were subsequently disbanded, really because of the desire for the colonials to have the land, and many were forced to migrate away. There are tribes out west in Oklahoma that are federally recognized, in Wisconsin that's federally recognized, and up in Canada that are part of the Canadian system. But we remained, and those that are in Canada have referred to us as the keepers of the land. Those who remained were forced to adapt to Anglo-American lifeways, and we lived in small tribal communities. These are the tribal communities that continue around the Delaware Bay to this very day, with the same families being documented back to that time period. According to laws during the colonial era, we wound up being misidentified because it became inconvenient for the colonists to continue to acknowledge the existence of tribal nations within their colony. One example is that in 1740, a law was passed indicating that the definition of an Indian was a non-Christian living in the woods and eating primarily deer meat. And that was updated in 1770, indicating that Indian was one who was living far away from the state. So my ancestors that lived in European-style homes and lived in European-style communities, had adopted some of the life ways of the colonists, were eating chicken instead of primarily deer meat, were no longer considered Indian, especially after baptism. There are records that show that many of the Nanticoke and Lenape ancestors that were identified as Indian prior to their Christian conversion, when they were converted, were no longer referred to as Indian, but were referred to as either free persons of color or as mulatto, and no longer Indian. This was a way of actually committing a form of genocide that some call administrative genocide or genocide of the pen, where you simply reclassify a people and deny their existence. Next slide. However, even though there was a general denial within the colony of the continued existence, and the history books for many, many years favored the concept that all of the Lenape and Nanticoke people had left the state, and most, in fact, did by about 1740 and began moving westward into Pennsylvania and further west into the Ohio Valley and whatnot, and further north all the way up into Canada. We know that there were so many that continued to remain in community here. It wasn't that we returned to the land, we never left the land. And those of us that stayed stayed in southern New Jersey in Indian towns and Indian fields that the families were documented to be on at the end of the 1800s, and those families are still there in those same spots even today. Our tribal ancestors were documented in early federal records on muster rolls during the French and Indian War. They were identified as American Indian in Seaman's papers during the early part of the 1800s, during the Civil War, and in census records, some of which actually were changed by the census keepers who did not want to have a record of Indian existence within their state. So what happened was, when, even though the citizen may have indicated their own racial identity as Indian, by the time it went, or indicating Nanacoke or Lenape, by the time it went back to the census office, there was a line drawn through, and the census record keeper would put in whatever they thought it was, continuing this type of administrative genocide. But nonetheless, there are many government records that identify our ancestors going back into the 1800s. There are news articles, anthropological and ethnological studies done during that time period straight up to the modern era that make it very clear that our tribal families were known and records were being kept. And some of our family members even were sent off to Indian boarding schools, such as Haskell out in Kansas. Next slide. The way we maintained community during these times of difficulty, when our identity was being challenged, when it was challenging and could even be life-threatening under certain circumstances to assert your identity and assert the rights of your tribe, we continued to have an organized community through our churches. And the picture that you see on the screen are of 3 of the churches that are acknowledged by the Board of Global Ministries of the United Methodist Church and by the states of Delaware and New Jersey as historic Indian churches. Each of these churches have histories going back into the 1800s. The congregations continued to be the center of tribal community life. The leaders of the church were the leaders of the tribe. And when there was an influx in 2 instances, there was an influx of non-tribal people joining the church, and churches actually split for fear of the control shifting away from Native families and no longer being able to have the tribe govern itself within the churches. Each congregation served as the hub of tribal activity for over a century. And each of these congregations continue to this very day. In fact, the photograph on the lowest on that list of photos, that column, is the one that's in New Jersey. The St. John's United Methodist Church just received a heavy endowment to preserve its history and to continue to ensure that that it is kept up. So we are very pleased with that, because that is the tribal church for the Nanacoke Lenni Lenape tribal nation. Next slide. We continued to maintain government and within the congregations, and at various stages in the history of each of the 3 communities, there was an effort to organize outside of the church and to reestablish a tribal council and elected tribal chief. And that happened in New Jersey in the late 60s and early 1970s, where a new generation decided that they were no longer going to hide in plain sight, so to speak, but we're going to advocate for their rights. The photograph, the oldest photograph up on the upper left-hand corner, is actually of Nanacoke tribal leaders on the Delaware State House steps, together with a Mohegan Indian, Gladys Tantagwidgeon, who was also a famous anthropologist, advocating for the rights of the Nanacoke people down in Delaware. Below that, the next black and white photograph are those that reorganized the Nanacoke Lenape outside of the tribal church and established a tribal council and elected chief. Next slide. Our community has continued with its relationships with those that we engaged during the colonial era. In southern New Jersey and northern Delaware was New Sweden, a colony set up by the Swedes and the Finns. And we have maintained a relationship with that nation ever since. In fact, when the King of Sweden visits, when the royal family visits New Jersey, or even when they opened their new embassy down in Washington, D.C., we had audience with the family and with the royal family. And you see here our tribal chief, Mark Gould, shaking the hand of the King of Sweden and various members of the royal family with people from the Nanticoke Lenape and community and the Lenape Indian tribe of Delaware. Next slide. We also have continued 350 some odd year friendship with the Quakers. We lived in friendship with them, having given land grants to them in southern New Jersey. And this even goes prior to the arrival of William Penn in the early 1680s and the famous Penn Treaty in Philadelphia. We actually had a relationship with John Fenwick and his colony here in southern New Jersey. And one of the sites of our cutting treaty with Fenwick and the Quakers had been the oldest tree in New Jersey up until about 2 or 3 years ago when it fell during a storm. But the site is still there, and we maintain a very close relationship with the Society of Friends, the Quakers. Next slide. We have continued our community. We're a historic, continuing tribal community of interrelated families. To join, you have to prove your genealogy and the percentage of descent that you have from the core tribal families that are documented as of the late 1890s, early 1900s. And we're alive and well, perpetuating our arts, our crafts, our music. And we continue to be in fellowship and advocate for tribal sovereignty, supporting our sister tribes all over North America, and our members, voting members of the National Congress of American Indians, the Alliance of Colonial Era Tribes, and Unity, which is a intertribal organization for our youth. Next slide. For more information about our people, I just wanted to share some of the links here that can be made available to you so you can learn a little more about our people. And I thank the Historical Society for the Historical Commission for allowing me to make this brief presentation. Wanishi. That is the next presentation, I believe.
Thank you, Reverend Norwood, for that great presentation. I want to remind the audience, feel free to add any questions you might have now. We're throughout these presentations to the Q&A tab, and we'll have a Q&A section after everyone has had a chance to present. Our second presenter today, Claire Garland, is a member of the Sandhill Band of Indians and director of the Sandhill Indian Historical Association. She received her BS in education from Monmouth University and an MS in sociological and philosophical foundations of education from the Rutgers University Graduate School of Education. A lifelong educator, Claire taught for 36 years in the Tinton Falls School District. Claire's teaching has not been limited to the classroom, but includes regular presentations to schools and community groups throughout New Jersey, where she has shared the stories of her ancestors. She serves as a resource person for the New Jersey Commission on American Indian Affairs and is co-chair of the New Jersey Historical Commission's Public Education Initiative about Indigenous history and life in the region. In 2020, Claire received the New Jersey Historical Commission's Award of Recognition for her lifelong contributions to the field of New Jersey history.
Thank you. If you can find the slide that says preserving. Okay, that one's good. Isaac W Richardson. I can start on that one. That's my presentation. Yes. You can go back. Yeah, okay. Hearing stories throughout childhood of our Cherokee Indian family forced to leave their lands in northern Georgia, heading to Canada for refuge, created a desire to save the Sandhill story from the dustbin of history. Our story is the story of many American families, like small boats tossed about in a sea of historical events. A story of survival, the story of finding a Puritan safe haven, of building communities, of the Protestant work ethic, of becoming prosperous, believing in family self-sufficiency, the story of a mosaic of searching for the American dream, finding our roots on the heritage tree. I discovered a sketch and article of 3 Cherokee chiefs visiting King George in England in 1732 and again in 1763. Diplomats making a trip to England made me curious about what else I didn't know about our people. On the slide, you see my grandmother's grandfather, Isaac Reeve Richardson, lived 1818 to 1904 in Monmouth County, was born in Eatontown, New Jersey, to Rebecca Reeve and Joseph Richardson, who is mentioned in a property deed in 1826. I located Isaac's account book of 1855 to 1877 at the Neptune Historical Museum, where the Sandhill collection had been housed. Isaac recorded building contracts for houses, churches, schools, Masonic temple, barns, fences, coffins, built and delivered around the shore towns, trading horses, wagon trips, taxi trips around the area. He lists employers, workers, wages, paid $2 a day, tons of coal, baskets of vegetables, fruits that were shipped to markets from Eatontown Dock, which we call Oceanport Marina. It also lists an indenture of Jonathan Richardson for 1 month to Benjamin Corliss, and he would receive $10 and a suit of clothes. It recorded another way of life. No electricity, heat by shoveling coal in a furnace. He lists dozens of property records, acreage used for lumber, for cutting and milling and transporting to work sites. He uses dollars and also shillings. He lists credits and debits. The Richardsons and Reeves owned hundreds of acres of property under the Monmouth Mall, under Eatontown Circle, under the UPS building on Hope Road in Tinton Falls, and under Monmouth County Reclamation Center. Many are buried at the Locust Grove Cemetery, White Ridge Cemetery in Eatontown, Shadow Rest off of Squonkam Road, and Mount Prospect in Neptune. Next is Elizabeth Susan Reeve, lived 1826 to 1898, was born and died in New York City. She was living with her mother, Suzanne Van Surley, and her father, Richard P. Reeve, at 6 Late Street, Manhattan, which was a farm at the time, with chickens and cows. After the death of her grandmother, Margaret Van Surley, in 1842, the property was sold to American Express. At age 18, Elizabeth married her distant cousin, Isaac R. Richardson, in 1844 in New York City. They became the parents of 8 children born between 1848 and 1868 that formed the Sandhill clan of Monmouth. The American Express New York City property was eventually demolished during the construction of the Holland Tunnel and the expansion ramps in the 1920s. More about the Lenape, Delaware Reeves later in the talk. Next. This is a Sandhill Council photo taken in the area of 1950. The grandchildren of Elizabeth and Isaac, and my grandmother is in the middle, kind of in the white dress. Next. The Sandhill Council showing James Lone Bear Reeve on the left, who served as director of the New Jersey Indian Office until his passing in 1998. Grandmother's brothers, Isaac, Jonathan, Robert Richardson, and James's father on the right, Robert Reeve, and Chief Rias Crummell, born 18 71, was the first grandson of Isaac and Elizabeth until his passing in 1963. Next. Here are descendants of Theodore Richardson, sisters Edmonia, Marguerite, and Alma, telling the story of Sandhill. We'll always be indebted to Edmonia for giving us many records, documents, photos. Also, thanks to cousin Theodora and Philip Ashby for decades of research assistance. Next was the family fire company, the Eureka fire wagon. Was a postcard. This was on a postcard. This fire truck was driven by Charles Richardson and housed in a barn on Springwood Avenue in Asbury Park. They were self-sufficient. They were prepared for providing for their community. Next, a grandmother, Adeline Richardson Thomas, born 1879, lived at Sandhill, told stories of the family till her passing in 1952, was always baking, and she had huge barrels of flour in the pantry. Next. Sandhill descendants gathering on Memorial Day every year to maintain Mount Prospect Cemetery plots, which we appreciate. Next. This is the anniversary, a 400th anniversary of the Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam at Ellis Island. Cousins Carol Clark and Suzanne Jewell participated in loaning Lone Bear's regalia for the exhibition. Next. This is, those are cousins from New York and Delaware. This commission on American Indian Affairs, when Autumn Wynn was chairperson. And I wish to thank Rowena Madden for assisting us in obtaining our Sandhill collection from the Neptune Museum after its closing. Next, one of the daughters dressed in 1890 garb with the hats and the gloves and the umbrellas and the silk dresses, and quite a get-up. Next. This is great-grandfather Isaac W. Richardson's house. The homestead included 8 acres on Sandhill. Brothers Theodore and Richardson bought another 7, totaling 15 acres in 1877 from James Bradley, the founder of Asbury Park and Bradley Beach. They constructed new hotels, houses, all through Ocean Grove, Asbury Park, and Neptune for the next several decades, and built the original boardwalk. Next, great-grandfather in the middle, Isaac W. Richardson, born 1851, became a master carver of picture frames, mirrors, fireplace mantles, and the family also had a printing business. Next, one of the last reunions at the homestead in 1953 with our grandparents and cousins. Next, Theodore Richardson's house was on top of the hill, was hit by lightning, and eventually had to be demolished. Next, Christina Richardson in regalia was one of the outfits held by the museum. She was a music teacher and organist in the area, and also played with Count Basie's band at summer resort hotels. Next, from our collection is this hand-beaded breast covering made from deer skin, matching cuffs, headpieces, moccasins, peace pipe headdress, deer knuckle attachments for dancing, which I take out when I do talks to put on display. Next, Sandhill cousins participating in local parades around the area. Many of us have gotten so old that we can ride but not do too much walking. Next, Johnson Reevy and Restell Richardson was one of the dozens of marriages between the two clans, Reevys and Richardsons. They were the grandparents of James Reevy. and had quite a bit of history attached to them. Next, another son, Joseph Richardson, born 1866, moved a family to New York to work, and the families went back and forth between New York and Sandhill. Next, one of the last pictures of the Sandhill marching band in 1950. I remember as a child seeing them proceeding on Springwood Avenue. Next, another daughter whose name was Susan, Rebecca, first name was Rebecca, named after Joseph's mother. And all the children were named after family members on both sides of the Reeve and Richardson clan. Next is the Indian paths in the area, which were widened for wagons and usually named as the Road to Shark River, or the Road to Long Branch, or the Road to Rumson. Next is a car driven by a grandson, Isaac Reeve Richardson, who also set up a limo and taxi business in Asbury Park for many years. Next is a map of the Monmouth County area. We're near the Navesink and Shrewsbury rivers, and Eatontown, Oceanport, Asbury Park, Neptune area. Next, skip. Next is a proclamation of Sandhill Indian Day by Monmouth County freeholders. And next is the Reeve Monument located at the White Ridge Cemetery in Eatontown. Property records for the Reeves go back to 1780 in Shrewsbury, which was called at the time, which was 9 years before Washington was inaugurated as president. Also military records from 1791 serving in Monmouth. Skip. The Smithsonian National Museum when it was being built, has a wall of honor in which the names of Isaac and Elizabeth Reeve Richardson were engraved. I think that one, maybe. Yeah, that one. And next is Chief Ryer's Crummel at the New Jersey State Fair in 1949, placing a ceremonial headdress on the head of Governor Alfred Driscoll. And thanks to the New Jersey Archives for numerous communication between the Sandhill Council and the governor's office. Next. And James Reeve was speaker of Lenape culture to numerous groups in school, a craftsperson, and was the proprietor of the Trading Post store at Penn Station. He provided many documents and conversations regarding Sandhill history. And I'd like to thank all the descendants for contributing to the photos, which there are hundreds of photos and documents for the research. Also to the HIP Foundation for the original writing funding grant, to Evelyn Stryker Lewis and the Neptune Historical Museum for housing the Sandhill collection for many decades, to Karen Flynn and Richard Beat for the New Jersey State Museum for including the Sandhill Indians in the Lenape exhibition, to Monmouth County Archives for research assistance documents, to the New Jersey Archives for research, and to many thanks to Randy Gabriellen, Rick Gefkin, Helen Pike, and numerous other authors for research assistance through the years. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. Our next presenter, Heather Brugel, is a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and first-line descendant Stockbridge Munsee. She's a graduate of Madonna University in Michigan and holds a Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts in U.S. History. She regularly gives talks on history, intergenerational racism, trauma, and activism. and helps to bring awareness to our environment, the fight for clean water, and other issues in the Native community. She has given talks to the University of Michigan, University of Wisconsin-Madison, College of the Menominee Nation, the Kenosha Civil War Museum, the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans, and the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. She also spoke at the first ever Indigenous Peoples March in Washington, D.C. in 2019. And in 2019 and 2020, she spoke at the Crazy Horse Memorial and Museum in Custer, South Dakota for their Talking Circle series. While Heather calls Michigan home, she is now the Director of Cultural Affairs for the Stockbridge-Munsee community in Wisconsin.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the New Jersey Historical Commission for putting this together and allowing me to be part of this today to talk a little bit about who the Stockbridge-Munsee are. Again, like Ine said, my name is Heather Brugel. I'm an enrolled citizen, the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, first-line descendant Stockbridge-Munsee. I'm coming to you from my office today, which is located on the Stockbridge-Munsee Reservation in Northeast Wisconsin on treaty land from the Treaty of 1856. This reservation was created by lands that were ceded from the Ho-Chunk and Menominee nations who are indigenous to what is now the state of Wisconsin. I'm very excited to be able to present a little bit of Stockbridge-Munsee history today and our unique connection with Lenape and Munsee peoples. So I will just go ahead and get started. First of all, we are known as the Mohicaniac people, which are the people of the waters that are never still. We are the river, also known as river Indians, because waterways were extremely important in our history. We settled along the Mahicanatuck, which is the river that flows both ways, and that is today you know it as the Hudson River. At one point in time, we numbered around 25,000 or more in our population. And that is huge considering the numbers that we have in Mohican Nation today. We were dominant along the Mahicanatuck River Valley and in the Berkshires, which are our ancestral homelands. The Berkshires are located in Massachusetts. And I will talk more about other lands that we oversee in just a moment. Our central council fire was at Skodak Island, and central council fire is basically just your seat of government before it moved to Stockbridge, and then later on, you could say our central council fire, our seat of government, is now located here in Bowler, Wisconsin. We were closely aligned with the Lenape. We actually referred to them as the grandfathers. So we worked together in different ways and had very close alignments. It was through land agreements that we, lost our land in the Mahicanatuck River Valley. Agreements, treaties, land cessions, and that's how we eventually were forced out of there and to where we are today. Next slide, please. So with the forced movement that really started in the early 1700s when we were moved further east near the Housatonic River in the Berkshires. And at that time, our first encounter with settlers and colonists was in 1609 with Henry Hudson. By the time we started to move in the early 1700s, the English had replaced the Dutch as the dominant colonized force in that area. And so we started to work with the English. There were different things that were happening. With the Dutch, it was the fur trade. And there was a fur trading post set up on present-day Castle Island that was started by the Dutch, which ultimately led to the decline in the beaver population in the area. And then it led to the beaver wars with the Mohawks. And it was really a war about economic dominance and who was going to have the dominance over the fur trade and also have that relation with the Dutch. This was later replaced by the English. And there was a lot that was happening. There were moves to civilize Native nations, including Mohican Nation. We, had different ways of life. We had different forms of government that was not deemed civilized by English society. So there were things that were happening to help to force us into a more Eurocentric society. There was also this idea of boundary lines and fences that started to be put up if land was being shared with Indigenous nations. One of the most notable of those is on Manhattan Island, where a wall was put up when the Dutch were sharing the island with Lenape peoples. And that wall later becomes Wall Street. So there is a huge significance to Wall Street on Manhattan Island. It's not just the center of the financial capital of the world. It is a place that we were forced out of as Lenape peoples. With the arrival of settler colonialists as well, disease also arrived. So there were times, smallpox, diphtheria, all these diseases that came over with the Europeans that we did not have immunity to, that were detrimental to indigenous nations. Sometimes hundreds of thousands and entire villages would be wiped out by these diseases. And that old adage of, giving blankets covered in smallpox to indigenous nations, that's not just, something that people say, that is something that actually did happen. And again, it wiped out entire populations of indigenous peoples. We know that when Columbus first arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, other than the genocide that was placed on the indigenous peoples in the Caribbean, disease ran rampant and wiped out lots of indigenous people. Same thing happened in the Northeast with our Mohican and Lenape peoples as well. Next slide, please. Stockbridge, Massachusetts plays a huge role in our Stockbridge-Munsee history. In 1734, you had a missionary by the name of John Sargent come into the village. At the time, it was known as Watukuck, and it was a Mohican village in a great field, in a great meadow. And he came with the idea of Christianizing the Mohicans who were living in that area. So in 1738, we gave him permission to start a mission in Stockbridge, and that mission house still stands today. It's located on Main Street. It used to be up on Prospect Hill, which would overlook the town of Stockbridge, but it was later moved down to Main Street in Stockbridge, and it is a museum now that houses history of John Sargent and Mohican history as well. The conversion to Christianity happened out of several reasons. One, because you wanted to. Two, because of survival. And three, because the indigenous people would see the prosperity of the settlers and think, maybe if I convert to their form of religion, things for myself will change, because clearly their God is more powerful. So that's also why it happened as well. And then other nations came to join us in Stockbridge as well. You had Oneida, Mohawks, Tuscaroras, Pequots, Narragansetts, who came to join us. And so instead of us being Mohican Nation anymore, we were then dubbed Stockbridge Indians, but also so were the other nations that were coming as well. They just dubbed us all Stockbridge Indians. And it was after more settlers, English settlers particularly, came to the area that the Mohican name of the village changed to Stockbridge, because the area reminded all of these settlers of an area in Stockbridge, England. So that's how the name changed. And because of that, that is how our name became Stockbridge Indians. Next slide, please. Being in Stockbridge, that was just one of the many places where we were moved to. After our time in Stockbridge, we moved to Madison County, New York, near Oneida Lake. We were able to get some lands from the Oneida Nation living up there, and they allowed for us to come and live in their area. And it was there that Mary Dockstader, who's a Mohican Indian, started a spinning school, and this spinning school was really successful. At one point, she ended up with 60 students in there, and it was all women. So it was women run, and it was women who were doing some amazing work. And Mary later on becomes a lawyer, actually, for our tribe to help with land claim cases in our homelands, and making sure that the voices of the Mohican Nation were being heard. In our time in what would become New Stockbridge, we created a gristmill, school. There was a new village that was started. Basically, we did a lot of great work there, but then we were forced to move again. Next slide, please. So after our move to New Stockbridge, we were then forced to move to White River, Indiana. And it was in White River, Indiana. We were led there by John Metoxen. And it was when we were going to be there, we were supposed to live with the Lenape peoples who were there, some of the Lenape peoples who were there, because with any forced movement, not all of every tribe moved. Some always stayed behind, and that happened not just in the Northeast, but in the Southeast. That happened across what would become the continental United States. So, but the Lenape who were living there were unfortunately forced into selling the land that they had. So there was no place for us to stay, and that's just part of the Lenape migration story as well. They moved several times, and we moved with them. And when we got to Indiana, they had been forced to again sell their land, and they were on the move again. So while we were there trying to do this, we had delegates in New York that were working with tribes and the federal government in the Wisconsin territory to be able to find places to live, in a place for us to be able to call home. There was continued pressure to always move. Before we left for White River, John Sargent, who was our missionary at the time, said about a third of my church and a fourth of the tribe, which was 70 souls, started from this place to White River. So he was aware of our journey as well. And again, John Metoxen led us there. After a year of getting there, we found out that there was no place for us to settle. Next slide, please. So what happens? We are then moved again, but in the course of all of this happening in 1830, May 6th, 1830 to be precise, you have Indian removal that is passed and signed into law by President Andrew Jackson at the time. And what Indian removal does is it grants the President of the United States to move indigenous nations in the eastern part of the United States to unsettled lands west of the Mississippi River. And that forms what we then become known as Indian Territory, which is mainly the Oklahoma and Kansas areas. In 1839, there were some Stockbridge-Munsee who left for Indian country, fearing that they were going to be removed anyways. And one of these was Lydia Quinney Hendrick, who was the widow of Hendrick Oppermott. And Hendrick Oppermott was one of our great diplomats and leaders in our nation. A lot of people left, but then they ended up coming back. Between this time, 1839 and 1856, there were a series of treaties and several congressional acts that were passed that directly affected the Stockbridge-Munsee community. So you had the Congressional Act of 1843 that was passed that made Stockbridge citizens of the United States. In theory, that sounds like a good idea, but what this Congressional Act did is it took away our right at sovereignty. So we were no longer a sovereign nation. We were no longer citizens of Stockbridge-Munsee. And this was a ploy to actually get more land. We then had John Quinney, who was one of our leaders, also a great diplomat, very well educated, who travels to Washington, D.C. 10 times in order to lobby on behalf of the Stockbridge-Munsee people. And he is very instrumental at then getting this Congressional Act of 1843 overturned. And then we have the Congressional Act of 1848, which basically reinstates who we are as Stockbridge-Munsee people, which is very, very, very important. At the same time, we also have different moves in the state of Wisconsin. After White River, we are then moved to Kaukauna, Wisconsin. It's in Kaukauna that we are then joined by some of our Munsee Lenape ancestors, and that is when we become the Stockbridge-Munsee community. And that's what we are federally recognized as the Stockbridge-Munsee community. We then after we do the same thing in Kaukauna that we did in New Stockbridge, New York, setting up a grist mill, school, etc., we're then moved because Kaukauna is along the Fox River, and the Fox River becomes a major waterway at this time. And if you know about the transportation history of the United States, rivers are a way to move goods, and whether that is trade goods, whether that is logging, so lumber, it becomes a major waterway, and it becomes a way of transportation and moving goods. So we are then forced out of Kaukauna, and then we are then moved to Stockbridge, Wisconsin, which is along Lake Winnebago, which used to be a very important wild rice lake for the Menominee people. We do the same thing again there, set up a town, and it's just as we set up things, we're then forced again. It is through that in the Treaty of 1856, that we have established our reservation here in Wisconsin, in Northeast Wisconsin, in the townships of Red Springs and Bartlemy. We currently sit as the largest employer in Shawano County, and we take that role very seriously. We also have a very rich land in lumber, and we do use sustainable forestry as revenue. Part of that, along with our Menominee neighbors who ceded this land and our Ho-Chunk neighbors who ceded this land in order to create us a home. So we have a lot of things going on here, and we do a lot of work within our Cultural Affairs Department to help preserve that history. We have the largest set of Mohican archives in the world, so if you want to know anything about Mohican history, you can come to us. We have that. We also work with our Delaware neighbors in Oklahoma when it comes to historic preservation in the homelands. So we also, we have settlement or had Mohicans primarily from the lower Mahicanatuck River Valley through the Berkshires, but then we also consult in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut, Vermont, and other areas as well, where our Lenape ancestors would have been. And we work in consultation with Delaware Tribe and Delaware Nation in Oklahoma to do that. Then we also have our language revitalization, which we are unique because we have 2 recognized languages in our tribal nation, which is Munsee and Mohican. And Munsee in the community has been around a lot longer. Since the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, there was work to revitalize that in the community, visiting our neighbors in Canada and out east to bring that language back. And then in the past 4 years or so, Mohican only existed on paper, and we have since then brought that language from paper back to life, and we are working on creating conversational speakers, so to speak, to be able to speak our ancestral or ancient language. Next slide, please. And I just want to leave you with this. This symbol is something that is extremely important to us in the community. This is our Many Trails symbol. Many Trails was created by Edwin Martin, who is a Stockbridge Mohican man, and he has since passed, but whenever we use this symbol, we honor him and make sure that we make it known that he is the one who created this symbol. This symbol in our community means strength, hope, endurance, and survival, and every single line in this symbol means something. So at the top, you'll see the curvature, the half circle, and those are arms raised in prayer to represent the praying Indians. The longer lines form a cross, which represents colonization or Christianization, I'm so sorry. The straight lines that you'll see represent the many trails that we've had to follow and go on through forced removal, and the circles represent our council fire. So this symbol in itself has a lot of great meaning for the Stockbridge Munsee community, and so that is what I wanted to leave you with today in order to understand who we are, our connections to the Mahicanatuck River Valley, the Berkshires, and to our Lenape brothers and sisters in Oklahoma and out east. Again, I want to thank the New Jersey Historical Commission for allowing me to present a little bit of our Stockbridge Munsee history, and I also want to thank my elders on this call who have allowed me to be part of this as well, and I am learning so much from you guys, so thank you very much for allowing me to be part of this.